When I met John Harbison earlier today, I was really nervous, and that's not always my MO, but he's the real deal. This is an icon of classical music, not just American classical music, but classical music in general. So let's give a huge warm welcome to John Harbison. He has been a student of this art that we all love, classical music, for his entire life. And he's here to share a little piece of that with us tonight. And again, it's just such an honor to be anywhere within his presence. Pulitzer Prize winner, MacArthur Fellowship, the list is quite lengthy. He has, I thought, only written 5 symphonies. I have just found out in the last 5 minutes there is a 6th symphony that he has just finished, and we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. 3 operas, several chamber works, so things like string quartets and duets and trios and wind quintet and numerous pieces for winds, concert band music, a ballet. The list goes on and on. So without further ado, I will stop that and we'll just get right to it and talk about this amazing legend, John Harbison. So if I say to you, tell me about who your teacher was in your teenage years, who are you going to say?
In my teenage years, I had a teacher named Matilde McKinney, and she was a piano teacher in Princeton, New Jersey. I went to her to study piano, and I played my first assigned piece, which was the Beethoven First Sonata. And she said, well, what else do you do? I don't know whether I ever want to hear anything like that again. And it was because I was already at that point basically a jazz player, and I kind of was swinging all the 8th notes and had an interpretive fix on that piece that she didn't feel comfortable with. I said, well, I'm composing pieces. Would you take a look at those? I knew she was a composer. And from then on, she taught composition. And my role with her was at the end of her piano recitals, she would put on one of my pieces. I thought she was a good teacher. She gave me every Christmas a score, a new score. And in those new scores were the Bartók 6th Quartet, which was a new piece, Agon, all the pieces that were new then. We think of them as new now, probably still,
yes.
but they're not. These were very thoughtful things that a young high school composer could well want to learn, and I studied them a lot. And I got interested, along with my jazz playing, in Bach cantatas, and those were pretty much the basic things that I've relied on ever since. The jazz that I was playing at the time and have kept playing, and all those Bach cantatas that I started learning right at that point.
The Bach cantatas, that's something you chose to study pretty much from point A to point Z, and you did not do that with virtually anything else, right? I mean, not all of the Beethoven string quartets or every Mozart opera or anything. I mean, you probably know plenty about those things, but the cantatas, you really dug into those, didn't you?
That was my chosen school. I had already in high school, I would go to the record store with my jazz playing friend Tom Martin, and we would listen to jazz. In those days, you could take out the record and put it into on a player in a booth, and we were learning the 2 things that we were interested in, which was Bach and jazz. And the jazz was mostly at that time traditional jazz, Louis Armstrong, on through perhaps to the Duke Ellington Band, but that was what we wanted to hear. And the cantatas that I studied at that point were the ones I could hear on recording and get scores of. And then not too long after, really quite a lot after, but not too long, maybe 10 years, I was offered a job conducting a group called the Cantata Singers. And I thought my preparation should be to study every cantata. And so I didn't own the scores, and I went into a library that had them and started with volume 1 of the Bach works and spent a couple days with each volume. And by the end of the summer, I had looked pretty closely at all 200 and taken notes. And that served me as the basis for a kind of lifelong continuing attention to those pieces, on the theory that it's good to know one body of work pretty thoroughly, and then, as you say, you won't ignore other things, but you need somewhere to be basic.
The Bach cantatas also taught you a bit about storytelling. Is that right? How to be lyrical with words and things along those lines?
Yeah, it dawned on me, not as completely as it maybe should have, but that there were great imperatives with Bach cantatas. You needed to know what the stories were, and you needed to know how they influenced the character of the composition. There's a lot of digging into those pieces in order to really comprehend why the composer makes his choices. I got much more thorough about this as I began performing the pieces, and actually more so in the last 20 years, when it seemed to me important to do the necessary studying of the prescriptions for the church day. Each of those pieces is written based on the Lutheran church calendar and a certain set of texts. And I've found that I needed to know those much more thoroughly than I ever thought I did, and I think I now can perform those pieces on such occasions as I can with better sense of why they go as they do.
Sure. You personally, not talking about Bach anymore, let's talk about John Harbison. You are quite a lyrical composer yourself. Can you talk about how that developed?
Well, for a while, I thought the best background for somebody who wanted to be a composer would be to study literature. And for a while in college, I was an English major, and I was writing poetry, and I actually was doing better as a poet in terms of recognition than I was as a composer. I didn't have a very harmonious relationship with the teaching staff of my college in music, but in literature I was somehow connecting better. But nevertheless, as soon as I got out of college, I realized that my literary life was more of a preparation for trying to understand texts. And I've kept up with that, and since then I have befriended in one way or another a number of poets and writers, and have written, sometimes intensively, a series of pieces with a poet until I felt like I was not freshly thinking about it, and then I would move to something else. And lately, it has been the poetry of Louise Glick, who is in this piece this week, and it's the third encounter with her texts. She turns out now to be a near neighbor of mine, but when I first got to know her work, she was living out in Western Massachusetts. I didn't know her. I do now, and it is and is not interesting and advantageous to know the poet. It can be all kinds of things. I feel like the poets that I've devoted a lot of energy to, like Carlos Williams and Montale and so forth, I didn't know them, but I feel like they are still companions of some kind. You really try to get more than just the sense of the piece that you're working on. I think you need to know much more than the individual poem that you're setting.
And you have worked with text so many times in your own music. Let's listen to some, if we could. We could hear a little bit of the Mirabai songs.
Where did you go, Holy One? After you
Okay, thank you. I hate to cut that off. The beautiful Dawn Upshaw singing the beautiful Mirabai songs. Tell me a little bit about that setting and what challenges you face when you're setting text.
I found in a wonderful place called the Grolier Bookstore, which is a very unusual kind of bookstore. It's actually subsidized. It could never possibly make enough money to exist, but it's a poetry bookstore in Cambridge. I found a volume of translations by Robert Bly of just 6 poems by Mirabai, which was and really a startling encounter. The place that these poems came from was so different from the mystical, religious, erotic poetry of the Western culture that I had experienced. And I felt like this was poetry where the personality of the poet was unusually strong. And then, so I'd set essentially the whole book. That's the set that I made. Bly subsequently did more, and so did a number of other translators. It turns out, I learned later that Mirabai is a tremendously popular and known poet in India. In fact, people sent me a broadcast of these songs in India, where they first talked about her. And I also received a Mirabai comic book from India. She's featured as the heroine of a comic book. And what they seemed to be saying was that she was like a real popular heroine. They also played some Indian music based on her text. And I later learned from Robert Bly, or actually went to a reading of his where he performed these poems with a sitar player and a dancer. Robert Bly has been extraordinarily cooperative in giving rights to my various incursions on his poetry, with the pretty firm injunction that he never has to listen to the settings. Which actually I prefer to some poets who just never respond to the request.
Sure.
For the use of the poems. Yeah.
Sure. I read just a line that kind of made me smile about your music. It says, most of his music is tonal. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that's probably right. It's not a particular interesting issue. But
Nice.
But I think one of the big opportunities of being a composer now is that we don't sit down and write a piece making a big choice with that issue as primary. There are so many rich possibilities for moving, tones and chords. I've now simplified my nutshell message to the young composers that I teach at Tanglewood every summer, or even at short visits, which I sometimes make to Aspen and other places. I start usually out by saying, really what I'm here is to try to get you to think about writing tunes and chords, which is a very old-fashioned position. But it's the one that interests me now much. It's a way, if I had to boil down what my problem is when I sit down to work, it's I need to find some tunes and I need to find some chords, and they have to be fresh enough and yet communicative enough for me to want to spend time with them. And I think many of the young fellows that I teach at Tanglewood don't necessarily immediately think about how difficult a proposition that is. Writing any kind of a melody that really has a shape and is received by someone else as a melody is really very hard, and it's either very hard or so easy that you don't give it a thought, and not much in between, and I think that eventually the 50, 60 years that I've been composing, leaves me just with that very elemental kind of confrontation about what you're trying to do when you sit down to it. And the chords, I was surprised when my own teacher, Roger Sessions, once said that he wasn't thinking about harmonic progression anymore, that he was only thinking about the density of the chord. I don't think that was true. I think he was trying to sound more up to date. But nevertheless, that discouraged me, because all that interested me about chords, and all it ever has, is the way they move. That is the grammar of the chord, which is the thing that goes on in jazz, and the reason that I still want to keep playing jazz. That there is some urgency and lymphatic system about harmony that is endlessly fascinating and is endlessly renewable. Melody it seems to me, is less transmittable culturally than harmony. Melody is partly perceived in national cultures very differently. I had a real shock in intermission in Italy at Eugene Onegin when I went around listening to the audience's reaction after the first act, and they said, well, this opera has no melodies. And what they meant was it had no Italian kinds of melodies. It had rather regular pulsed, downward scale, beautiful melodies. But they didn't go to a climactic note. They didn't have a kind of large soaring leap. They were Tchaikovsky melodies, which are magnificent, but they are Russian. And so melody doesn't necessarily cross boundaries as easily, I think, as harmony. Harmony speaks to another gut impulse.
Yes. Let's hear some of your third string quartet, if we could. If you could tell me, I would love to listen to the whole thing, but it's all in one movement. We'd be here a minute.
This piece is, it's funny, we were talking about harmony. It really, that's what it is. It's a hymnotic piece, and almost all the rhythms are unitary. That is, there's almost no independent rhythms. It's something that's kind of declaimed in rhythmic unison almost all through the whole piece. I don't know why I did a piece of this sort. It was so strange to the Lydian Quartet, my colleagues that I wrote this for, that my wife said one day, she said, "What have you done to the Lydian Quartet?" There was some kind of a gossip coming from them that they didn't know what to make of it because it was so much unlike the piece they thought they were going to get. They thought we were going to get something like my second quartet, which is basically a kind of Purcellian contrapuntal piece. And this was not that at all. It was because I, was really just gripped by this idea of I guess, some sort of a hymn sing for a quartet. And that's really all the piece tries to do. since learned from one of my colleagues, from Ursula Oppens, that, and this was reassuring, that often pieces that she commissioned that she first doesn't like or get sometimes turn out to be the ones she's most happy to have. And I sometimes say that to the fellows at Tanglewood, that when someone asks for a piece from you, it's not your job to do something like the one they liked. You know, it really is your job to do something that you have to make. And that's sometimes very hard for younger composers to grasp, because they think that part of the transaction is a gift back of the thing that's been praised. But that's the way only to keep writing the same piece, which, of course, we don't or ultimately really want to do that. Yeah.
Sure. Let's hear the next track as well before I... Tell me a little bit about Gatsby and the Gatsby Etudes.
Well, that's the Etudes from Gatsby. Interestingly enough, that music you just heard is all cut from the opera. It's the dance sequence in Scene 3 of Act 1, which is no longer part of the piece. It seemed to hold back the action a little too much. I think it was fun for the pianist to play that, that rag. But and I'm sort of glad it's preserved in the Gatsby Etudes. Quite by coincidence, about half of the Gatsby Etudes, which is a 10-minute piece, or over half, is no longer in the opera. And the cuts from the opera are not that large. So it just happens to be music which was party music or dancers' music. And as such, I'm glad to have it, so it remains. The knowledge that opera is a medium in which you need to be able to adjust has been shocking to me, because when you're a quartet composer or even symphonic composer, you don't expect people to say to you when they've heard the piece, it'll be fine as soon as you start taking things out of it. But that is the reaction to the theater, and opera people are very active listeners, and you do hear things like that. And I got so eventually I really appreciated that about opera, and it changed my ideas about composing quite a bit. That it put things up for grabs more, and I hope that's of use.
Now, The Great Gatsby, that was the opera that was commissioned from you by the Met, correct?
Yes, and interestingly enough, Mr. Levine, when the meeting,
James Levine
had a meeting with him right after the piece had run, and first thing he did, he wrote down on his little pad and it said, "Cuts, no," because he thinks of opera as a musical medium, as I do, but only to a point, and it's also something else. And eventually, I think I made a better shape by taking out a very small amount of material which was impeding the flow. It had nothing to do with musical value, which I find interesting about old operas too, that often they've been made better by taking out some really good music. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Occasionally, I can kind of hear you knocking on Stravinsky's door, particularly in Symphony No. 1. And we'll hear a bit of it in just a second, but I want to hear about your favorite composers, who you feel really shaped you as a composer.
Well, I've mentioned a couple. Stravinsky would be the major other one. My wife occasionally kids me after she hears a piece of mine. She said, "Well, you don't owe Stravinsky quite as big a royalty check for that one as usual." But I absorbed Stravinsky at a very early time. I would say it was in high school or before that I had a good deal of his music, and not the ballets as much as the violin concerto, the Symphony of Psalms, the great, well, Oedipus, certainly, the great middle period Stravinsky, which we don't hear much anymore, at least a lot of them we don't. Symphony in C, which I loved, and the Symphony in Three Movements. Those pieces were just like markers. They just you know, when you're that age, you just memorize stuff like that. Mozart piano concertos that just went into my head. I could actually play them. I can't do that with music anymore. I mean, I can't just hear something and play it back. But at that time, the absorption was very, very fast and thorough. So those Stravinsky pieces are in there, and I don't worry about them too much, how close I'm coming. By now, I can't do much about it, and beside, I think, you know, the a very, very first-class composer like that has enough to share, you know. I think the danger is to get too hooked on a composer who's more quirky and less substantial than that.
Sure.
So I still am happy to encounter Stravinsky in any form. I had the good fortune as a sort of apprentice composer, just out of school, to be in Santa Fe for performances of all of his operas and be his chauffeur for the summer. And so I stored up and will never divulge a huge amount of small talk. But it was a valuable, just a valuable experience.
Sure.
Hearing him talk to his wife in a bobcraft and off hours. I think it inevitably something like that. You do get some sort of flavor that is coherent with the music.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's hear a little bit of your first symphony. This is a piece you wrote in 1981, and this is the last movement. We'll just hear a couple. Just keeping conscious of what discussion we haven't even had yet, which is about this piece that you commissioned, that the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra and the American Composers Forum commissioned from you for the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. And we'll get to that in just 1 second. I have one more question that I want to ask, and I think we all could learn a great deal from your answer on this one before we get into that piece. Because we're fans of classical music, that's why we're here. We know a thing or two about what we like. We know what we hear. If you could give us some advice about 20th century composers we should know more about, or you wish you heard more on the stage, who would you name?
I think 20th century was a fabulous century. Really unbelievable. As good as any. And it's a nice question. Well, let's talk about a few composers who we're not hearing, but I'm still listening to, and looking at their music. Michael Tippett, I think a great composer who should be before us very, very often, whose music is both very exploratory and extremely immediate, and much more esoteric, but a great composer. Luigi Dalla Piccola, even in Italy, think not really much appreciated now, but someday. A composer of incredibly beautiful melodic invention, extraordinary sound imagination, just a really great composer. Back here in this country, I feel that we don't hear the classic American symphonists hardly at all. Bill Schumann, Walter Piston, Roger Sessions. It's really a large list. There are really great works by these composers. I feel like the Copland canon is not very explored. There are 5 pieces or so that are heard constantly, but having been president of the Copland Fund for about 20 years, I had the interesting and happy experience of needing to address lots of other issues in that catalog, and it's an extraordinary catalog, highly consistent with so many great pieces. I really would like to know more about it. I'm struck by the persistence of certain composers who were not thought to be persistent 30 years ago. Irving Fine, who still has many wonderful works still in the catalog. Samuel Barber is much more with us than we would have said he would have been 30 years ago. I'm proud of that, because after all, he's an international American composer. Morton Feldman, who is, to me, a phenomenon, a composer who is spellbinding when you hear it live and hard to decipher when you don't. But I don't think that's perfectly fair. There is such music. I would also really make quite a case for a number of composers from other countries that we don't appreciate enough here in the United States. Henri Dutilleux, a great master who, thank goodness, the New York Philharmonic recognized with a big prize right at the end of his life and performed a lot of his music. Really, really every work gold. I would also really hope that we go back a little further into the American canon. Ruth Seeger, a composer whose music is solid in every dimension. Also back from that era, I don't think we hear enough Varese. When I left school, Princeton Graduate School, the first thing I did was come back there with a New York group playing one of my pieces called Confinement. And one of the things that a couple of my teachers said with great disgust said, "You caught that Varese bug." Well, that was true. I think Varese is a absolutely special flavor, and I would love to hear his music more. There's many, many things in the 20th century that I think that are waiting for us. But I started almost in the order that I'm bothered with it day to day. That is, if I started over, I'd go back to Tippett and Dalla Piccola.
Excellent, thank you. Let's talk about Crossroads for soprano, oboe, and strings. This is the piece that hopefully you'll be hearing if you go to the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra concert. And I had the pleasure to sit in on rehearsal today and hear a little bit of it. Absolutely lovely and stunning, and I'm fascinated with so many things about it that I think will fascinate you as well when you hear it. First of all, pairing soprano and oboe is just shockingly gorgeous. How their timbres together are gorgeous. Can you talk about choosing that pairing?
Well, that's a Bach cantata pairing. I mean, there are so many soprano and oboe arias that I know, and I'm quite willing to risk that company because I've paid my dues so many Sundays, gotten up awfully early to do a cantata.
Sure.
At Emmanuel Church, Boston. But beyond that, it's a piece Well, let's just say Louise Glick has said to me directly, my subject now is getting older. And what's it like? She said, I'll spend the rest of my poetic life just embodying that subject. I said, okay, I'm with you. And that's what's striking about the book, The Village Life, from this come from. Both the tone of it, which was more forgiving and more accepting than a lot of her other poetry, but also wanting to deal with this subject, and that's what this particular piece is about. And rather shocking, I think, the way she approaches it in the last poem, the one called Crossroads, which I think is one of her very best poems. The subject being, she starts out saying, my body, now that we will not be traveling together. And that she, in the next world, that she will miss most her physical body. This is a hard subject, and it could be done, I think, much more harshly than she decides to do it. But it still seems to me a worthwhile and brave kind of poem. So that's really what attracted me to this piece. The big prelude poem is much more of a narrative, but it's really the same subject, letting go, the difficulty of letting go. And Louise has always been a quite fearless poet, and I expect to be with her not for the last time in this. It's also a piece. I think I'm writing pieces now at a very 3/4 of a century point, where I'm not interested really in impressing anybody. I'm sort of past. I'm just going to write the piece and see what happens, and that separates me a little bit from the people I teach every summer at Tanglewood, who are at a time of life when they have to impress people.
Yes.
And I don't. It's not that I don't empathize with that, but I have not a single impulse in my head in that direction anymore. I mean, just if it's not, if it doesn't come at you, there's nothing I can do.
Is there a part of you that wishes you had had that attitude when you were their age?
I did.
You did?
Oh, I did. I think a lot of people when you're in your 20s, you do. Yeah, yeah.
You also teach at MIT. We're kind of on this teaching thing for a moment. What, and then we need to wrap it up because we have some audience questions, I'm sure. But what's the? I mean, you're not teaching at Juilliard. You're at MIT. This is a different beast. What do you enjoy about the difference?
Well, I love teaching at MIT. I love the breed of student that comes there, which is now, I guess, the breed of student that's almost anywhere. They're tremendously alert and follow through. And I switched to the jazz department. I moved over about 5 years ago. And so now I'm a player coach for MIT vocal jazz and for 2 combos. And I play in a faculty ensemble called SIN, Strength in Numbers. And it's been a big change, and I think it'll keep me going.
Sure. How different are the students at a place like MIT compared to somewhere at Juilliard? I mean, they have a little bit different focus.
Well, they're not very different from a student at the UCLA.
Okay.
Or Michigan. But they are different from Juilliard. And the way they're different from Juilliard is that their attitude to music is volunteer and unbridled adoration and enthusiasm. And they don't make professional choices about what should interest them more than something else. And that's incredibly pleasurable. Because teaching future professional musicians, my battle is constantly to try to persuade them that something is important to them that they don't think is important to them. But at MIT, anything that I've placed in front of them, be it a Monteverdi Madrigal, which is I'm also coaching now, or songs by an obscure songwriter like Ruby Bloom that we're taking on this year, they leap to it with a great deal of trust and enthusiasm. So teaching professional musicians, I think the battle now is to convince them that a Bach cantata is as vital to their future as a musician as the big aria that's going to get them the job at the St. Louis Opera. And that's a really important task for us as musicians who are experienced, but I think a difficult one compared to what I take on at MIT.
Mm-hmm. Do we have a mic for audience questions? Yes, go for it. Any questions? Are you going to ask, or are you carrying the mic around?
Don't be shy. I'll start with one. Get us going. You mentioned 20th century composers and jazz. I was wondering where your jazz inspirations might lie.
I'm probably frozen in time, but I think a lot of jazz culture is like that. I'm still very gripped by Thelonious Monk in every dimension, as a player, as a composer. The Ellington Band, the Jimmy Lunceford Band, the great arrangers like Fletcher Henderson of the big band era, they're endlessly fascinating. And I listen to a lot of new jazz with a sense that the technical capacities are wildly beyond any of these old guys that I listen to. But I do feel that some essential thing about jazz is a kind of heart and a kind of engagement with a huge range of human emotion, which I'm not sure is as much the goal of the jazz community now. My crusade in jazz is to educate jazz musicians in the way that they were in the radio era, before there were textbooks and formulas and patterns and a pedagogy. And so that only their ears and only their receptivity is training them. And that's why MIT offers me a little lab of that kind, and that's what I'm trying to investigate. But I'm still as fired up about hearing a Lester Young solo or a Billie Holiday recording as I ever was. There's something completely indelible I feel about the great jazz musicians.
Thank you very much for coming. My husband and I were lucky enough to see The Great Gatsby at the Met. And it had this extraordinary cast, as I recall. Helen Hunt Lieberson was in it, and Susan Graham, and I don't remember, but I remember those two. And thank you very much, because it turned my husband on to modern opera, which I never thought was going to happen, but it did. Here's my question: what drew you to writing that opera? Was it the jazz? Was it the poetry of Fitzgerald, or was it James Levine saying, "Hey, we got an idea. Are you interested?"
Well, it was my idea that I had to convince the company could be an opera, and I was also a librettist, which was very much what they hoped I wouldn't be. But it was just the I heard opportunities for music all over that story, and that was really what was pulling me along. In fact, the reason I couldn't really work with the librettist was I moved ahead and kept getting a lot of music before I had the words. I knew what the color of the scene was and so forth. So I started fitting. I was making what I call dummy words, that is temporary, but the temporary words stayed because they were with the music. I later found out, around the same time, that with certain librettists, other composers also did that. But then they would just order them to fit the rhythms, and I didn't really want to do that. So it really was, it was just musical opportunities. If I were ever crazy enough to write another opera, that would be the only criterion, is can you, the composer says to yourself, can you find a very engrossing musical color for an action or a moment in a story? And to me, that's always what opera is about the specific color of the scene, or the chance to change the light or the time of day, which I think is only in opera.
Thanks for being here. I'm curious, with a background in jazz and the stylistic approach to the performance of that type of music, and when you're writing for, a group like the SPCO, and do you ever desire that they would incorporate more of those stylistic interpretations into a piece that you write for a completely different, non-typical jazz ensemble, or kind of how that plays out, and how much you coach or maybe desire that some of those interpretations are part of that performance?
It's an interesting question. I have tried, you heard one example today, the beginning of the last movement of that first symphony, where the jazz reference is somewhat specific. What I've tried to do in instances like that is have it carried completely by the notation. And often the players will come to me in playing a piece like that and they say, do you want us to swing it or inflect it? The answer is always no. Symphonic performers, I think, will perform that best if you've notated the inflection quite the way that you want it and they simply deliver it as good concert players. The two idioms are different, and I really genuinely feel that a jazz player even reads printed page differently from a symphonic player. So what I've tried to do is develop a skill just with the accents, with the dynamics, with the articulations that will convey without any editorial stuff on the performer's part, whatever jazz feeling I'm trying to get. But it's endlessly a gray area, and I think I'm always holding out for a certain literal quality, which I don't think is always expected. It's a translating problem. Yeah.
Hi. Which other art forms most influence your writing?
Certainly literature, particularly poetry, because I read poetry just for pleasure and to follow it. Short stories. I'm a devotee, an acolyte, helpless fan of Alice Munro, and finally persuaded her to let me use a text of hers for a mezzo soprano and orchestra piece. Visually, I've felt like I'm trying to build up. I've even set myself some projects of writing a piece like based on 6 paintings in the Metropolitan Museum and so forth, just partly trying to become more visual, because we're in a very visual world. And part of opera is about the visual nature of it. I feel like if I were ever to work in that field again, I need to be more acute seeing. But it's never been in my natural faculty at all. But the literature is ongoing, and I think I'm always alert to that sense in poetry of something that you don't understand. I think I'm always attracted by what's been left out. My original attachment to Eugenio Montale was the fact that I thought that everything that was important that happened in those poems is not in the poems.
Thank you very much for talking to us. You mentioned about Mirabai's bhajans. It's mostly written in Hindi, and it's highly devotional because Mirabai considered herself to be a bride to the Lord. So it is mostly sung in Hindustani. Mm-hmm. So what is the connection between that genre of music to Western classical?
I took those to be devotional poems for sure. And I was attracted partly because they were devotional, expressed themselves in a way that our tradition doesn't have, except in very rare cases. I thought of John of the Cross, this medieval poet who seemed to me to intersect with that kind of thinking. Initially I tried working with Indian rhythms and scales. And that version of the piece I had to throw out. That was the beginning of a summer. And then I started over with a couple weeks left in the summer and just worked with a very synthetic version of those impressions. I would have to say, if I were to describe it, a more touristic version, which was something I could do rather than something I couldn't. And that's really what the piece is. But the sense of it being part of a devotional tradition, which we don't know, was a huge part of its appeal to me as a text. Remains to me, it remains to, I think, to the audiences that hear the piece, probably the most unusual and the most engrossing encounter as part of that piece. That she's relating to her religious emotion is working on a plane that is very unusual for someone from our culture.
We're in the back. I don't know if you can see us.
I have a question. I really enjoyed your discussion of what you valued in 20th century music. I have a question about 21st century. When you were talking about working with young composers in Tanglewood, I found your discussion of trying to get these composers to think about chords and melodies as really fascinating. Would you say that's a paramount value? Do you think that's a way forward? That's if at least it's something that a lot of young composers are missing. Is there some kind of fundamental value architecture that no matter what direction they move in, they should be thinking in those terms?
I hold open the possibility that it's possible to build a very engrossing and viable music without thinking about those categories at all. This is a very personal bias that I'm expressing. And if we were talking about the 21st century, I'm very partial to composers Jim Primash, Andrew Wagoner, Steve Mackey, for whom these values are still very persistent. Or recent students of mine or fellows of mine at Tanglewood, Helen Grime, Charlotte Bray, Jane Stanley, Andrea Pinto Correa. I mentioned a bunch of women composers by accident there, but the field is now 50-50 is at least. But composers whose interest is very, very strongly in tunes and chords. They would probably be a little insulted to be described that way because, of course, they're the spear carriers, the vaulting into the next phase of music. I recognize that too about them, and I recognize that they're working with material that I wouldn't understand. One of the things I think that any artist of any time has to accept is that the art is going to move forward in a way you can't predict. Some of the time you can't understand, and it's going to be good. A large proportion of it. I think one of the reasons I'm still a useful teacher is that I hold that possibility open. And I think the abrasiveness of my talking about tunes and chords is probably useful to some of the people who come to Tanglewood, not all. We still take people at Tanglewood who are interesting to us, who are not interested in tunes and chords.
We have time for one more question.
Hi there, way in the back. I don't know if you can see us. I think it's fair to say that all of us who compose music, as with any art, it's some kind of very personal passion that's brought us to it. And as we strive to bring our music about, we often find that passion threatened by obscurity and scarcity, and perhaps most of all by indifference. And so I'm wondering, based on your experience, what would you advise composers? How should we approach our work, and what should we aspire to that protects that passion and preserves the joy of composing that brought us to it in the first place?
Well, the responsibility is our responsibility as composers and the listener's responsibility. It's a shared thing. And the thing I always try to get across is that our problem as composers is to balance our inner ear, which is our passion, and our investigative self, with our outer ear, which is what people who are not us are mainly going to hear. And if we don't pay great responsibility to the second thing, we risk being hermetic and difficult and misunderstood. So we bear some responsibility on our side of trying to listen from outside ourselves. And I find that the most radical underdevelopment in young composers is in their outer ear. Their inner ear is their drive and their fascination and their inspired self. And their outer ear is the thing that enables someone else to make head or tail of it. And we basically have to do both those things. And as a teacher, I add my stupidity as a listener to what the young composer brings me and try to impress them with the importance of that stupidity.
Thank you so much for being here. Just such a pleasure